So let's talk through the pros, cons and general power level of fielding every single Space Marine unit in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd do a general overview of every single unit in the Codex, talk through them one by one, talk about their points costs, their positives, negatives, and how they're faring in game right now with a slightly arbitrary score out of 10. In this one I'll be going through all the standard Space Marine units, so not the divergent chapters, just the units in the core Codex, as believe me there's plenty enough of those. And I'll also try and mention a few relevant detachments for some of these units, as in 10th edition in general, units can be massively better or worse depending on the detachment. Let's jump straight in though, and we'll start out with infantry units before moving on to bikers, vehicles, generic characters, and then named special characters. First up on the Space Marine battle line we have the Intercessors, 85 points for 5. A fairly cheap Space Marine unit with OC2 each and some fairly punchy guns. Compared with a bunch of their bolter wielding equivalents, they've got good AP, they get the assault and heavy keywords, and they have a couple of extra little damage things like a power fist on the sergeant or a grenade launcher on one guy per 5. Perhaps their single biggest draw though is the fact that they get the sticky objectives type rule, so it can be quite nice to just have one unit in an army list for that alone to mark your home objective with that, and then maybe move off towards other things if it makes sense. And besides that, they have good character attachment options, and they might kind of like the Anvil Siege Force if you happen to be playing that one with their heavy keyword. On the other hand though, with most of the Space Marine battle line units, they just don't have that great damage output compared with more heavy hitting elites units. Even if the standard intercessors are better than most, they won't be doing too much against enemy tanks and vehicles. The defense I'd say is merely okay at this sort of points cost. They've got diminishing returns on their objective rule, so once you have one copy of it in the army, I feel like a second copy is just less valuable. And perhaps particularly so out of Space Marines, they just have a massive amount of competition for their battlefield role. Loads of other cheap units with bolters and things. Overall, I've scored them a 7 out of 10 here, certainly solidly usable, but generally in small numbers in the most optimised lists. For their chainsword wielding brothers, the Assault Intercessors cost 80 points per squad of 5. These guys are nice and cheap and a bit more durable per point compared with the regular Intercessors as a result, and again they bring the high OC to the table, similarly have good character attachment options, better than most in the Codex, and they have their special rule where they get to reroll wound rolls against units on objectives, making them really quite good at clearing out anything that's fairly low toughness and low save. For downsides, compared with things like the jump intercessors, they're kind of slow to get into melee, and they might not necessarily be getting the charge rather than the other way around. And while they are fairly brutal against clearing any sort of enemy horde type units, they're probably not going to have the all-around threat enough to deal with enemy elites. Overall they are cheap and have got some pretty good countercharge threat with a power weapon on the sergeant, and I do see people running them in competitive lists, often in small numbers as objective skirmishing type infantry. Perhaps one weakness for their competitors though is that a few similar squads bring something really quite interesting to the table with their special rules, whether it's sticky objectives or things like the infiltrators, incursors, or scout squads, whereas these guys just bring better skirmishing against lighter stuff. Overall, I'd rate them a 7 out of 10, definitely not unusable, typically in smaller numbers. Perhaps could be kind of interesting for certain attached characters as well, say Ragnar Blackmane, who'll certainly like full rerolls to wound against enemies on objectives if you can get it. Next up, we've got the Chunky Gravis Armoured Intercessors. The Heavy Intercessors are 105 points per unit of 5, and their main draw is just to bring massive toughness to the table for that cost. They do put a lot of durable wounds on the table at toughness 6 and 3 wounds each, and they're even more durable against damage 1 where they improve their save. Their bolt rifles are longer range and higher strength, plus you get a heavy bolter in the unit, though given that they do cost more points than the standard intercessors, I wouldn't necessarily say that their damage output is better, not outside of some specific targets. Otherwise they get the fun stuff of the assault and heavy keywords, which work okay in Anvil Siege Force, good objective control, and could be an interesting enough place for certain Gravis characters, maybe Ironfather Phyros, to give him an exceptionally tanky unit to walk around with while he buffs vehicles. For their weaknesses, their damage output is just kind of bad for the cost really, particularly as they lack any sort of power weapon like the intercessors get, which is kind of a shame as it's the sort of profile that you'd really like on the midfield and making the enemy have to work hard to delete them. They perhaps feel like they're in a bit of an awkward place, where if you put them on a backfield objective you might be slightly overcommitting more than you need to there, and if you move them up towards the midfield they're not particularly good up close. And for that reason they just don't really seem to get that much play in competitive lists, even if they are fairly easy to use and pretty adequate in more casual lists. It also maybe doesn't help that the Space Marines have got quite a few good units to hold home field objectives, things like Infiltrators or Whirlwinds. Both of those could be a bit more used on a home field objective depending on what you want. Overall, definitely not unusable though, and I might be being a bit harsh on them. I've chosen to rank them a 6 out of 10 here. Perhaps a unit that rarely makes it into optimised lists, but still really isn't too bad. They do bring some very chunky defensive stats. Finally, for the Space Marine battle line, we've got the trusty Tactical Squad, 160 points for 10 Space Marines, cheap objective control 2 bodies that can split into 2 different combat squads. I guess the main draw being the special weapon, heavy weapon, and power weapons that the unit gets within it. Unfortunately, these guys just really do feel very, very lacking in my opinion. The average guys are kind of like intercessors but worse with their bolter damage. The special and the heavy weapon are okay but not crazily stand out. Probably the biggest draw is having something like a las cannon or multi-melter within the unit. I think maybe the most letdown thing though is that the special rule they have with their combat squads that basically allows you to fill the unit in more efficient 5s, but that's something that just about all their competitors can do anyway without a special rule. And in the Codex they lost their thing where they could fall back and shoot, which was at least kind of handy. Overall, I feel like Games Workshop could probably drop the cost on these to be maybe a bit more similar to the Black Templar Crusader squads. At the moment, I feel like they're just overcosted for what they bring, and there's too many good competitors. I've chosen to rank them a 3 out of 10. Moving beyond the battle line for other power armoured Space Marines, first up we have the Inferno squad, 85 points per 5 Marines. A standard sort of Space Marine stat line, their main strengths being mass strength 5 auto hits from their Pyroblasters, for genuinely very savage damage against light infantry, and perhaps just as importantly being able to threaten some absolutely massive overwatch into the midfield. They feel like a unit that's a lot stronger with Vulcan Hestan about, or the Firestorm Force where they can get some devastating wounds, and I rate them as far stronger if either of those are about than if they weren't. Their special rule triggers a battle shock test, which is alright, but maybe a bit limited value in your own turn. And compared with the other troops, they're perhaps no less good against anything with high saves or high toughness characteristics. And being short range with no inbuilt assault keyword does mean that they might struggle to get those Pyroblasters where they need to be. They are only objective control 1 as well versus the battle line units. Overall, I've chosen to rank them a 7 out of 10. Not too bad for their intended horde destroying battlefield role, maybe a little bit mediocre given that they don't threaten a whole bunch of units in the game, but really quite nice with Vulcan or Firestorm. Next up for the Stern Guard, they're 100 points for 5 or 200 for 10. They're essentially 15 points more than Intercessors for a fair bit more danger, an extra attack on the Sergeant, a heavy weapon in the unit that can be a devastating wounds heavy bolter, and their standard small arms are far more serious compared with the Intercessors, with 3 shots to 12 inches with devastating wounds on them. Their special rule got toned down quite a lot and is now just slightly better Oath of Moment with reroll 1s to wound. And otherwise they're kind of interesting for First Company Task Force, where they'd quite like the full wound rerolls turn, which could be quite good to focus down a unit, and it could be okay with maybe Tigurius, who can get them some free Overwatch and can't join certain other things like Hellblasters. Currently though, Stone Guard don't seem to be particularly favoured on the board, just seeming to be a bit considered overcosted for what they bring to the table. Now that Oath of Moment no longer has full wound rerolls as it did at the start of 10th edition, devastating wounds just became a bit less relevant for them, and it would just contribute a bit of chip damage as opposed to carrying the whole unit. And between all that, it means that they're just not really that efficient against hard targets, even if they're a bit better than some of the other choices. They also don't bring any objective controlling rules to the table like the standard Intercessor squads, which might be genuinely better on a cheaper squad. Overall, I've chosen to rank them a 5 out of 10. Again, I'd still say not unusable really, but very rarely making their way into competitive lists. Next up, we've got the new Space Marine Command Squad in the Company Heroes, a 95 points for 4 models infantry unit, and these guys have to join either a captain or chapter master, getting you 4 models with really good toughness, 4 wounds and a -1 to wound while the character still lives. I'd say that both their damage and defense are kind of mediocre. The champion can fight okay in melee, and they get a slightly boosted heavy bolter, but nothing particularly exciting for almost 100 points. They do at least bring a fair bit of objective control for points and things though, with the Ancient's banner giving you +1 objective control. Weirdly, these guys just seem to be kind of bad with the standard captain that you can play. His main boost is free stratagems for his unit, and these guys aren't a particularly good target for most stratagems. But basically for any captain or chapter master that has a lot of value besides the actual squad that they're leading, things like Uriel Ventris, Vulcan Hestan, or Grandmaster Azrael, all of these are genuinely really quite efficient with them. Not too bad to have a fairly tanky unit where the captain's already got lots of value from their other rules, and then they can just be an annoying bully unit in the midfield. Otherwise, for weaknesses, besides not talked about, they don't have any invulnerable saves at base, which does mean that they're a bit susceptible to any sort of high AP anti-tank fire. I guess Azrael helps with that if you're playing Dark Angels, and I feel like they're a unit that is just really variable depending on whether your unique characters are actually good for these or not, as the generic captain isn't very exciting in my opinion. I've chosen to rank them a 7 out of 10, maybe a bit of a halfway here. I'd rank them lower if you don't have a useful special character to put with them, or higher perhaps if you've got one of these. Next up, we've got the Blade Guard Veterans, 90 points for 3 or 180 points per 6. They're notable as perhaps the most well-rounded melee damage dealers in Tacticus armor, and are perhaps some of the best choices for a whole load of characters to attach to as a result. Things like chaplains, Judasirs, and certain melee captains and things. They strike with a whole bunch of Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 2 melee that goes through Space Marines really quite easily. They get a bonus damage or defensive type rule to reroll some 1s. Their durability is okay with 3 wounds and Storm Shields. And while I certainly say that a weakness is that they're kind of slow to get to melee, certain detachments can really help with that, things that allow you to advance and charge, or they could be delivered via a Land Raider. For weaknesses, I'd certainly say that slower moving is one of them, though otherwise their damage will struggle against anything with strength 10 or more, usually meaning that they're best to pair with, say, a lieutenant with some lethal hits, or say a +1 to wound with a chaplain perhaps. Their squad size is a bit annoying to work with an impulsor as well, which is a shame. You can't have a maxed out squad plus a character and fit them all into an impulsor, which is kind of annoying as that cheap transport could be a reasonable option for them. Overall, I've chosen to rank them an 8 out of 10, at least a fairly common unit for people to build around with big damage or defensive synergies, or other infiltrating things like infiltrating them into the mid-board in Vanguard. Next up, we've got the Primaris Hellblasters, 125 points for 5 of them, or 250 per 10. These guys spit out some nice general purpose Strength 8, AP 3 and Damage 2 shooting with overcharge. Quite nice with a lieutenant to give you some lethal hits, but certainly amazing for slaying enemy Space Marines and things that are T8 or lower. 24-inch range is quite good, and they can do that on the move with the Assault keyword, or stay stationary for +1 to hit with Heavy. And being potentially really quite a big and dangerous ranged damage dealer unit, they can be quite good with certain synergies like the Gladius Fire Discipline one, or the buffs that the Anvil Siege Force can get to heavy weapons, or the Vanguard Spearhead shooting buffs. Their special rule is shooting on death, and I would argue that's a good one, both because they might kill themselves with some of their own hazardous rolls, but also just getting a flurry of shots in the enemy turn can be really quite big, say maybe mowing down some fragile melee troops before they make combat. You could also use transports to deliver them safely, maybe a repulsor with its countercharge things, or perhaps shooting out the top of an impulsor, where that could soak some of the hazardous results. For weaknesses, hazardous rolls will gradually chip away at the unit if you do keep on overcharging. Defense for the cost really isn't good for 25 points per Space Marine profile. If the enemy can shoot these, then they're pretty high value targets. If you've got no way to fall back and shoot, then their shooting might be ruined if they get locked in combat. And with their damage output, wounding heavies on a 5+ isn't really all that reliable. They're not terrible against harder targets, but aren't as good as dedicated anti-tank. Overall, I've chosen to rank them a 7 out of 10. Quite a destructive and easy unit to use. They're still not really all that commonly played in competitive army lists for the Space Marines. Next up, we've got the Firstborn Devastator squad, 120 points for the 5 or 200 for 10. They get you some focal heavy weapons on the table, maybe quad las cannons, multi-melters, or grav cannons. They get to ignore cover when they're static, and gets to flip a dice once per game to a 6 with an Armorium Cherub, which is actually a pretty decent damage boost on the turn where it triggers. And for unit synergies, they make quite good use of the heavy keyword for Anvil for a potential +1 to wound, and could be interesting enough for the Razorbacks with the wound rerolls that can give you. That seems to pair quite nicely with the multi-melters maybe. For the downsides though, their defense is really quite bad for the cost, and for big dangerous firepower units they've got quite a lot of competition from fire support tanks and dreadnoughts, which often do what they do but without being quite as fragile, plus there's options like Eradicators or Hellblasters which can fire a bit better on the move. Talking of which, the heavy keyword means that they'll be hitting on a 4+ if they have to redeploy, which isn't great, and they're a little bit more limited as to which sort of characters can join them. They can't take lieutenants, for example, which is a downside compared with those other 2 units mentioned. Overall, I've chosen to rank them a 5 out of 10, maybe being a little bit harsh here, but again a unit not really commonly played on the competitive scene, though if you just want some focal heavy weapons with a bunch more las cannon shots, they're not really too bad for that kind of purpose. Next up, we've got the missile launchers upon missile launchers with a Desolation squad, 200 points for 5 of these. pairing a bunch of Castellan launchers and their Bengal launcher with some big hitting super crack rockets. Between the two, I do think they have enough damage output to justify themselves even at this very high points cost. Though I feel like you'd have to kind of carefully play with Ignore's line of sight stuff earlier in the game and then think about getting some value out of the direct fire rockets later. Ignore's line of sight shooting is pretty handy though, and they have multiple copies of the blast keyword, which means that you could get lots more hits on hordes. Quite nice just to be able to put a bit of focal infantry killing firepower where you need it. For the downsides, at 40 points per marine body, their defense is spectacularly bad for the cost. If the opponent has got their own indirect fire or fast movers that could see them, they're going to have some high rewards for shooting at these guys. In general, whirlwinds are considered the best way to go if you want a bit of indirect fire in Space Marine lists right now. They've got really quite a nice general purpose profile and are far tougher. And now they can't be taken in huge units with big synergies with attached characters. You can't even go down the very big investment routes to try and make them more efficient. Overall, I've chosen to rate them a 4 out of 10. They do feel overcosted at this point, and while I don't think they need to go down to that ludicrous 120 points or so that they were at 10th launch, they could probably be a bit cheaper. Next up, we've got the Eradicators, 95 points for 3 or 190 for 6. They get really enormous anti-tank or anti-monster damage with Melter with full rerolls for hit, wound, and damage. And even if they're firing against those kind of targets at to 18-inch range, they have some of the best damage output in the entirety of Codex Space Marines, then going up to absolutely ludicrous levels if they can get within 9 inches. Firestorm works really quite well for them, giving them the possibility of Strength 10 Melter up close, plus Advance and Shoot to be able to get them in range, as can Gladius offer that, and otherwise they might quite like the Repulsor to be able to deal with them, or they could use Strategic Reserve. For downsides, their durability per point isn't that great at just 9 wounds for around 100 points. They'll be resilient to small arms fire but not much else, and they're also short ranged and move very slowly, so it means that you do have to think about getting a delivery system for them. Otherwise there might just be more area denial if they're on the board. Their damage isn't that great against anything that isn't a tank or monster, and triggering those big rerolls, which is the main source of how efficient they are. They've got a heavy keyword that's a little bit redundant, as you're almost always going to need to move them, unless your opponent has for some reason just left them where they can stay stationary and blaze away at them happily. And with an infantry unit getting up close, the enemy might choose to lock them in melee, and then ruin their damage output for next turn that way. Overall, despite all the drawbacks, they do have some of the best numbers in Codex Space Marines if you can get them there. Overall, I'd score them an 8 out of 10, reasonable enough to fill the dedicated anti-tank role for some army lists. Next up for some jump packs, we have the Vanguard Veterans, 105 points for 5 of them, or 210 for 10. They're fast-moving infantry with fly, they get built-in deep strike, and when they charge into combat, they get a whole volume of Strength 5 AP1 attacks with lethal hits when they charge in. Beyond that, they can either take fancy pistols or shields. I'd probably go for the storm shields out of the two. And besides characters from within Codex Space Marines, they feel like they could be particularly interesting from Kavan Shrike, and maybe a little bit more interesting in Blood Angels as well, though they do have things like the very dangerous Death Company to compete with there. In general though, at 105 points, they're just generally not considered general purpose enough for their price tag, with low strength AP and damage, even if lethal hits does help a bit. And despite the rather big advantage of Storm Shields, I feel like they're in some pretty stiff competition with the much cheaper Jump Intercessors, which I do see more people use. As a result, I've chosen to rank them a 4 out of 10, maybe could be a little bit better if Shrike's on the table, who's very good, but their strength and AP just keeps them from being particularly good heavy hitters to deal with the toughest enemy stuff around. For the more standard Space Marine Assault Squad now, we've got the Jump Pack Intercessors, 85 points for 5 or 170 for 10. Again, they've got built-in deep strike and have a bit of an advantage over the Vanguard Veterans in that they're quite a cheap unit that could be used to drop to do secondaries and things, at least if you're not using Inceptors for that role. Their damage output basic guys only get Strength 4 and AP 1, but they do get a Plasma Pistol and Power Fist within the unit, and when they charge into combat they get a bunch of Mortal Wound impact hits on the charge, which definitely helps them round out against other things in the game. Again, they could be kind of interesting with various characters, maybe Blood Angels with Dante or Sanguinary Priests. For downsides, while I don't think their damage output is really too bad given the mortal wounds, they are a bit reliant on getting the charge to get that. If they're deep striking, any sort of charge will be quite unreliable, so they might want to drop somewhere safe and then go bounding in next turn if they're not just moving up the board. And they do have lots of good competitors for objective skirmishing type units, maybe things like Inceptors and Scouts in particular. Still though, I'd rate them as really quite a usable unit with their good movement and capable of bullying lighter enemy infantry units. I've chosen to rate them an 8 out of 10 here. Next up, for 85 points, we've got the Suppressors. They basically feel like autocannon jump pack devastators, firing out some strength 8, AP 1 and damage 2 shooting, which I would say is maybe a lot better against certain targets compared with others. Things that they wound on 5s or have high saves aren't going to care too much about that. Otherwise, they've got a -1 to hit for one given target, so they get to debuff one enemy unit. That could be kind of big if you just put that into the biggest and most threatening enemy unit out there. Otherwise, they could also drop 4 secondaries, similar to the jump intercessors, and they do have the heavy weapon keyword for the Anvil Siege Force. I do think they do have some pretty bad weaknesses though. They're really very easy to kill for Space Marine bodies for almost 30 points, and unlike Desolation Marines, they can't fire out of line of sight. They have to choose between hitting on a 4+ or remaining stationary, so their good movement's still going to be a trade-off. They don't have any character supporting options. They're a small unit size that's not really going to be too great for any sort of damage dealing stratagems, and perhaps above all they're competing with the very good Inceptors, which with their 3-inch drop rule loads more people take. Overall, between all that, I've chosen to rank them a 5 out of 10. A bit overshadowed right now, I think. Talking of those Inceptors, it's 110 points for 3 or 220 for 6. These guys have that fairly godly meteoric descent to drop anywhere outside of 3 inches of the enemy. Means that you can absolutely guarantee doing certain secondaries, potentially sneak a primary objective that your opponent isn't holding very decisively, and just get some pinpoint damage exactly where you need it, maybe turning them up in a place where your opponent's going to struggle to deal with them next turn. Their damage is good, as both types of weapons are really usable. The bolters are better against hordes and marine profiles, where the plasma will punch up a bit better against 3 wound stuff or tough vehicles, and the twin links rule helps with that too. They have the pistol keyword, which means that if you lock them up in melee, they can just shoot you in the face, which is better than some things like Eradicators. And while I think they're pretty great in just about any detachment, they may be particularly nice in Firestorm, with a +1 strength and +1 to wound stratagem available. They're even more deadly. For weaknesses, they are quite low toughness when they're on the board, and you will have to choose between several different ways that you might use them. They can't do everything at once, and you're going to have to choose the single best way out of those. But overall, it seems that the vast majority of Space Marine lists are running at least some of these on the competitive scene. I've chosen to rank them a full 10 out of 10 as a result. I feel like you're rarely going to be making the wrong choice by taking a couple of units, and some people run more. Onto the Phobos units next, and the Incursors at 85 points for 5 or 170 per 10. These are scouting Phobos Marines that can move up the board a bit, have some slightly boosted range and melee with some useful weapon keywords on their gun, but otherwise basically just standard bolters, and they also have a Haywire Mine for a little bit of extra damage when the squad first contacts the enemy up close. Their main draw though is just to be able to mark one enemy unit for a +1 to hit for the entire rest of your army. Really quite big if you've got a focused gun line, and you could use this on something that you weren't using Oath of Moment on. That rule does feel like the main reason to take them, as it could have a lot of value and lead to a lot of extra damage if it affects some really quite big and important units. For downsides, compared with the Space Marine troops that only OC 1, Scouts generally maybe isn't quite as powerful as Infiltrate for things like the Infiltrators or Scouts. I think there may be a unit that you might want to have one of to be able to access the special rule, and then you get diminishing returns after that. And I guess theoretically, if you do have Oath of Moments and you both just wanted to put them on the same big target, there's a bit of diminishing returns and anti-synergy. That's either way you're going to be hitting with most of the hits automatically anyway. Still though, if you've got a fair amount of gunline Space Marines, I feel like one unit is rarely going to be a bad choice. I've chosen to rank them an 8 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the premium Deep Strike Denial that are the Infiltrators, 100 points for 5, which is how I'd feel them. Their big draw is definitely their Omni Scrambler special rule, which means that the enemy can't deep strike anywhere within 12 inches, which means that if you had these guarding a home field objective, it'd be very safe from enemy reserves turning up. The 12-inch Deep Strike Denial does work on things like the 3-inch drop that the Inceptors have. Otherwise, they're a little bit tankier than the standard Space Marines per body, given that they've got the 6+ Feel No Pain from the Helix Gauntlet. They've got the option to infiltrate to start in the mid-board if that makes more sense, say if you knew that in this game your opponent didn't really have any reserves to threaten your home field. And they do have the interesting option of taking a Phobos Librarian along, which means they can't be shot at long range. That's about as safe an objective as you could possibly make it. If the enemy can't drop within 12 inches of you, they can't shoot you at long range, they'd actually have to get right up close to you to be able to threaten the unit at all. For downsides, they are only Objective Control 1 versus the Space Marine Battle Line units, so if they are scrapping over the midfield, they might get muscled out with objective control points. Their damage output is very limited for the cost and only really all that good against light infantry. And I would say that after you've got 1 or 2 units, you're definitely getting into diminishing returns. The special rule might not be worth it against all opponents. Some use deep strike, some don't. but I feel like one unit of these is almost never a really bad idea. I've chosen to rank them a 9 out of 10, pretty amazing home objective defenders, with the option to play them differently depending on the opponent. Otherwise for the Phobos, we've got the Scouting Reavers, 85 points for 5 of them, or 170 per 10. The Primaris Terror Troops get inbuilt Deep Strike if you give them the Grav Shoots, which I would. And then you've got a fairly cheap Deep Strike unit that can do some Battle Shock debuffs, and get a whole bunch of Strength 4 AP 0 attacks with precision. I feel like perhaps their most interesting things could be the Phobos Lieutenant that could join them. It means that they could have a drop down, move, shoot, move closer to the enemy, and then make a very close range charge. That could be kind of fun even if their damage is bad, and it could be kind of fun in the First Company Task Force, where there's an enhancement that can trade failed battle shock tests into slaying entire enemy models. Their big downside though is that in general they don't really kill things very well. A whole bunch of Strength 4 AP 0 attacks are going to be good against light infantry, but not really good against anything aside from that. If you want cheap deep strikers, jump intercessors could do that as well, and they're a lot more threatening. And for the Battle Shock shenanigans, while it's certainly not useless, they do need to be very close to activate them and still have a high chance to do absolutely nothing. It's not really quite enough to justify the unit in most people's eyes. Overall, I've chosen to rate them a 4 out of 10. I feel like they're a unit that Games Workshop still hasn't really managed to get right, either needing some Battle Shock rules that do things just a bit more reliably, being a bit more dangerous, or just being cheaper. Next up, we've got the Eliminators for 75 points. They're a cheap infiltrate unit with stealth, and compared with the other infiltration and Phobos type units, their damage output is actually kind of good. You get to choose between bolt sniper rifles, which are fairly threatening to characters, or some somewhat general purpose las fusils. There's options for how you could play them. You could use them as cheap expendable screens, or in the right matchup you could maybe have them sit and shoot, getting devastating wounds and +1 to hit, maybe +1 to wound as well in Anvil. And otherwise they do have the option to take the Instigator Bolt Carbine. That one allows them to move, shoot, move, so you could have the unit go across the board really quite quickly at 12 inches per turn, or do some slightly gamey things, popping in and out of terrain, firing off some shots and then retreating to safety. For their downsides, being a cheap unit means they're not really great for stratagems or leaders to be attached to them. 75 points just isn't really worth the investment. Their defense for the cost is fairly poor if they're exposed, even with stealth. They've got lower OC compared with some other midfield skirmishers, and they've got some very strong competition from scouts and infiltrators. I feel like if either scouts or infiltrators had their points cost adjusted at some point, they might take on a bit more of a central role again. I still rate them as solidly useful though. I've chosen to rank them an 8 out of 10 here. Speaking of scouts though, they're just 55 points for 5 of them. It really is quite good to get an infiltrating unit for that cheap, particularly one that is actually fairly robust and quite tough for the cost with 2 wounds each. That's a lot of value right there, even if they didn't do anything else. For 55 points for board control purposes, having Scout and Infiltrate is pretty big in combo though, means that they can just have that final bit of positioning to either go aggressive or defensive after you know first turn. I think they've got enough damage threats to skirmish quite well with their equivalents in the enemy army. They can get that fun sniper rifle and a heavy bolter seated within the unit, and it's quite nice that they can have the option to take a shotgun as well, which means they could still advance and be eligible to do secondary action type things, if that was needed of them. Finally, if it did make sense to reposition them, they've got that handy return to reserve special rule. That means they could threaten to pop up and do secondary objectives, or maybe even threaten the enemy backfield. Quite handy to have that option if they do manage to survive till later in the game. For weaknesses, I feel like the scouts are just generally going to add good value to most Space Marine armies. I guess perhaps they're the best target for enemy small arms having the worst save in the Codex. Even with that though, I feel like you're almost never going to go wrong by adding in a couple of cheap squads of these to hold down the midfield early and just be annoying trading units. Again, I've chosen to give these guys the full 10 out of 10 here. Next up, for 110 points for 3 or 220 for 6, we've got the Aggressors. Chunky Primaris Gravis Armoured Elites. These guys have a whole load of damage threat, lots of anti-infantry shots with AP-1 against the closest target, and a lot of those get twin-linked as well, so they get to punch up a bit better than some infantry-style shooting. And then they follow that up in combat with a whole bunch of twin-linked Power Fist attacks, hitting on a 3+ since the Codex update. Having fairly spectacular general purpose damage, it does make them quite nice a choice to be led by characters, things like the Gravis Captain or Apothecary Biologist, or maybe Marnius Calgar even. And they're some of the standout units for some of the best detachment combos out there, like the Fire Discipline shooting combo in Gladius with the Apothecary Biologist, or the devastating wound stratagem in Firestorm to get those torrent flamethrowers do some horrendous damage on 6s. It could be interesting as an infiltration type unit in the Vanguard detachment as well, with a character with that trait. For their main weaknesses, despite having heavy armour, they're really quite fragile for the cost. 9 wounds worth of Gravis for 110 points really isn't that tough. And because they're slow moving, they do need some way to deliver them, maybe a Land Raider being the most obvious one, though some detachments or chapters might have other options. Overall, I've chosen to rate them a 9 out of 10, one of the scariest central damage dealer units for the Space Marines, and can have some great combos. The Terminator squad is 185 points for 5 of them, or 370 per 10. It's one of the biggest and tankiest and scariest units that the Space Marines can field, so it's quite an interesting option for characters to go in it to improve the whole load of them, or things like stratagem synergies. Anything that increases damage or defense would be quite nice, maybe particularly Armour of Contempt with their 2+ saves. For their stats, they've got really quite good defense with 3 wounds at toughness 5 with their 2+ armor save, have a little bit of shooting with their Cyclone missile launchers, and back that up with some mass power fists. Their special rules help with the damage output with Fury of the First, and they've got the option of the Teleport Homer to threaten some rapid ingress, though even if they don't use that, rapid ingress could be interesting enough for them somewhere else on the map. They're also a pretty central unit for the 1st Company Task Force as well, given that they can teleport them around the board, and use a lot of their stratagems in the best way. For their weaknesses, their damage output is kind of low overall for the cost. They are very slow when they're on the board, and they'll be competing both with other Space Marine big damage dealers like the Aggressors, but also chapter-specific Terminator units like Space Wolves, Deathwing, or Deathwatch, which all add interesting things over and above these guys. Overall, I'd say they're usable, but not enormously standout or auto-include. I've chosen to rank them a 7 out of 10. Otherwise, their counterparts with the Thunderhammers are the Terminator Assault Squads. I'd say they're broadly really quite similar to the Terminators in how I'd assess them. I generally want to go with the Thunderhammer and Storm Shield for tankier Terminators with 4 wounds, and devastating wounds with the Thunderhammer attacks. The devastating wounds that they can get en masse here could be kind of interesting with Black Templars, as if you ever get into combat with a Psyker, you could get their devastating wounds to go off on a 4+ against them for a 1 command point stratagem. For weaknesses, compared with the standard ones, they have literally no ranged firepower, they cost a little bit more, and they lack that Fury of the First special rule. Instead, they have a Battle Shock when you charge into the enemy, which I'd say is less good. And again, they could struggle to catch things when they're on the board once they've teleported in. Overall, kind of similar, just going for a bit more of a melee flavour as opposed to a mixed. I think you could make arguments for both units, and I've also chosen to rank them a 7 out of 10. Next up, we've got the Assault Centurions, 150 points for 3 of them, or 300 for 6. Everyone's favourite Space Marine inside a Space Marine has some really good damage output up close with those siege drills. Big hitting damage 3 twin linked attacks that get extra benefits against enemy vehicles with sustained hits. I say their durability is okay, but maybe not standout for the cost, even with their 4 wounds and 2+ armor save. They do make good use of Armour of Contempt though, or just about any other stratagem that you can give them, given that they're just really quite a big threat unit. Firestorm could maybe help their shooting out a little bit. They do pack some flamethrowers that could be used for the torrent stratagem, and there's a fair few other options that could give them choices for trying to get close to the enemy, which is maybe their main problem. Speaking of which, I'd say their biggest issue is that they're slow moving and short range. They need delivery to melee, and maybe a Land Raider could be an option, though they often tend to be reserved for big things with character attachments, and the Centurion Assault Squad can't take any of those. Anything with good anti-tank with good AP will also destroy them fairly easily, and they're a bit more uniquely weak to Plasma and Melter, which might have a tougher time against vehicle damage dealers. Overall, I've chosen to rank them a 6 out of 10. I feel like they're just maybe a little bit harder to use to the extent where a lot of people don't bother, but if you can get them where they need to be, they definitely have the damage numbers to make themselves threatening. Otherwise, we've got the Centurion Devastator Squad, 175 points for 3 of them, or 350 for 6. Their long-range damage output numbers do stack up fairly well against the competitors. They're kind of similar to things like Gladiator Lancers, Repulsor Executioners, and Ballistus Dreadnoughts. Typically, most people go for the twin las cannon and missile launchers as their default loadout. Having a few blast missiles that are quite threatening is quite nice. Their damage gets better against enemy units on objectives to give you some full hit rerolls, which can be fairly powerful. And as with the Assault Centurions, they make really quite good use Armour of Contempt and can maybe get cover a bit easier than some with infantry. Perhaps the best way to field them at the moment is in armies that could teleport them around the battlefield. Deathwatch, Black Spear Task Force could be interesting for that, as could things like Uriel Ventris and the Vanguard Spearhead, and that could be a reliable way to get lines of sight with those big guns. For downsides, they are really quite slow moving at 4 inches, and they will be competing against tanks and dreadnoughts for that anti-armor sort of role. The tanks and dreadnoughts both tend to be a little bit tankier on the whole, and also really quite a lot faster, so they should be able to get lines of sight easier. Otherwise, their durability really isn't that great, though hopefully they might be able to outrange some enemy attacks that would be hitting the assault centurions. And again, no characters can join, and being locked in combat could be really quite bad for them, given that you'd be locking up a very big amount of scary firepower. Overall, I've chosen to rank them a 7 out of 10. Good damage output, but maybe competing poorly with tanks and vehicles in most armies. If you're doing things like Vanguard or Deathwatch teleporting shenanigans, then they will get better, I think. Next up, we've got the Outrider squad for 95 points for 3 or 190 for 6, and you can take an Invader ATV in the unit. As bikers, they move quite fast and can auto-advance 6 inches as their special rule, and they're pretty much the focal unit for the Stormlance task force, with most of the stratagems and synergies all revolving around mounted units. The idea of these guys going 18 inches and still charging could be really quite disruptive and gum up the enemy lines turn 1. The damage output's quite good against light infantry, and I'd say their defense is okay for the cost given 4 wounds, though still not super standout. But unfortunately, I feel like at this price tag, the Outriders just really aren't in that good a place, as they're a bit overcosted. Only having strength 4 and AP 1 damage 1 attacks means they just don't threaten anything heavy to any meaningful level. Having the squad be a big 95 points isn't the most useful for a sort of fast attack skirmishing type of role. You'd ideally want them to be in smaller, more expendable units if you could take them like that. And I've got some competition for fast movers that can deal a bit of damage. Things like the jump intercessors do that really quite well. Overall, between all that, I'd rate them a 4 out of 10. It'd be really nice if Games Workshop expanded their options to give them some special weapons or a power weapon on the Sergeant, or failing that, they could perhaps be a bit cheaper. Supporting the Outriders is the Invader ATV, a 70-point mounted unit with 8 wounds, fairly fast moving, and gets a return fire sort of special rule to protect Outrider units nearby. It is quite cheap compared with the Outriders, so it's alright for a bit of interference and being a bit more expendable. I guess theoretically that multi-melter could do okay with some Ironstorm rerolls. Again, like the ATV though, I would say that these guys are a touch overcosted for their damage and defense. A single multi-melter and a few bolter shots just really isn't all that exciting for 70 points. It's maybe a slight shame that you can't have the option of taking them in bigger, say 2 or 3 units to be a bit more efficient for stratagems and things. Overall could be alright for skirmish placeholders, but I've really not seen very many competitive lists running these whatsoever. I've chosen to rank them a 5 out of 10. Next up, for 75 points each, we have Fire Strike Servo Turrets, a ballistic skill 2 gun with either anti-tank or anti-elite firepower. Out of the 2 weapon options, I'd certainly say that the las cannons are more exciting than the auto cannons. They're essentially strength 10 twin-link las cannons that do compete kind of okay with other Space Marine sources of anti-tank, but don't really outcompete them and just fire at the same sort of level. Beyond that, for gimmicks to sell them, they've got their 4+ Overwatch, which genuinely isn't too terrible, but it does mean that you have to spend a CP to even make use of that at all, and you probably want a unit of 2 to be able to do so, to actually make their damage output a bit more reliable there. And I guess for boost to the units, maybe the Firestorm or the Ironstorm Spearhead could be interesting. Getting some rerolls or being able to advance and shoot does actually give them a little bit of threat range. For these guys though, I'd say their biggest downside is their movement. They only move 3 inches under normal circumstances, so basically getting the same sort of firepower as you might get on tanks and vehicles, but with being almost immobile at the same time. If these guys are tagged in close combat, they might not actually even be able to fall back, even if they want to, if the enemy's wrapped around them a bit. Like the Centurions, they're a bit more uniquely vulnerable to things like Plasma and Melter, as opposed to just dedicated anti-tank guns, and they feel like a unit that should have been kind of good in the Anvil Siege Force, but unfortunately they're not heavy and already hit on a 2+, so the core faction rules aren't great for that. Overall, I've chosen to rank them a 4 out of 10. I think realistically they aren't entirely unusable, and having some more static firepower guns in the army isn't the worst, but just maybe feels like they're not really doing much that tanks and vehicles with the manoeuvrability couldn't. Let's get on to those tanks and vehicles now, and we'll start out with the Walkers and Dreadnoughts. The standard Firstborn Dreadnought is 135 points, and his main draw I think is an aura of reroll 1s to hit for nearby infantry, potentially making him into a mini buffing unit alongside 1 heavy weapon and a bunch of strength 12 damage 3 melee attacks. Compared with the Redemptor, he's got the same sort of profile as that, and I guess that's not bad to have that on something that costs far cheaper in terms of the combat damage. For downsides though, he only moves 6 inches, so that won't actually make it very easy for him to reach melee. The range damage output isn't really all that exciting, with maybe one twin las cannon or something else, and I feel like he might do a bit better buffing Space Marine infantry castles if they were a bit more regularly used. The majority of lists aren't building around static Space Marine infantry firepower, and even if they were, there might be a little bit of redundancy between this guy's reroll ones to hit and Oath of Moment. Overall, I would say that he's a bit outcompeted by the other Dreadnoughts and vehicles right now. I've chosen to rank him a 4 out of 10. Next up, we've got the Big Bad Primaris Dreadnought in the Redemptor. This one's 200 points, and for that cost I'd say it has really quite good durability, a 2+ save and -1 damage, and it can be seriously tanky between Armour of Contempt and Cover as well. As well as that, it's got quite a nice mix of range and melee threat, perhaps the big plasma cannon plus some Onslaught Gatling cannon and small arm fire as it closes in, and then has that similar sort of melee profile to the standard Dreadnought. I think as units go, with a fair bit of flexibility and both being fairly tough and fairly threatening at range and melee, it's kind of easy to use, which definitely isn't a bad thing. I would definitely enjoy things like the Ironstorm Spearhead like most big vehicles. As for downsides, I'd say the range damage isn't quite as strong as a few of the other vehicles out there, no doubt paying for the melee damage that it's got as well. It's maybe a bit of a jack of all trades and master of none, and on the defensive, anything that just has excessive AP and excessive damage, like say things like hammerhead railguns and things, are really going to make a mockery of the defences that it's paid a fair bit of points for. Still though, really quite a big, strong and stompy walker. I've chosen to rank it a 9 out of 10 here. For its melee counterpart, with the Fist or Talons, we've got the Brutalis Dreadnought. He's 175 points, so a bit cheaper than the Redemptor. He loses the -1 damage rule, but otherwise has the same stat line and is still fairly tough. His main draw is the enormous amount of melee damage that he can do, 6 attacks with Twin Link Strength 12 attacks, plus some mortal wound impact hits, and before he gets there he could take a stab at destroying some enemy tanks with twin multi-melters and some stubber shots. He might quite like detachments that allow him to advance and charge like Gladius or Stormlance, just to give him the option of doing so if he needs to. For the downsides, he is really quite dependent on reaching combat to have good value, and maybe compared with some he is a little bit predictable. You just need to shoot him down before he gets to melee, or move block or screen him or something. Only 8 inches with the vehicle interactions with terrain probably means that he is going to take some heavy firepower before he gets there, so hopefully he'd have multiple threats moving to try and attract enemy firepower. Out of the 3, he does seem to be the least frequently used out of the Redemptor chassis Dreadnoughts, but definitely does see some good competitive play. Overall, I've chosen to rank him a 7 out of 10, a pretty scary Space Marine countercharge Dreadnought threat. Next, for the Firepower Dreadnought, we have the Ballistus, big Strength 12 las cannons and Strength 10 missile launchers that you can swap out for a blast missile launcher if needed, and its big reroll hit rolls will be likely triggering more often than not. The Ballistus Dreadnought's got good range, and it's perhaps stand out for its durability amongst the other rivals in the Space Marine vehicles. A 2+ save and 12 wounds for 140 points is really quite nice on something that cheap, so it should hopefully be a gun turret that the opponent struggles to do as much about compared with some of the rest. Perhaps the biggest weakness is that it's going to struggle to deal with things that are toughness 11 or more given the strength 10 missiles, and its reroll hit roll rule won't stack with Oath of Moment, which could be a little bit of anti-synergy there, though I suppose you could use Oath for something else. Seems like quite a nice one for Ironstorm Spearhead as well, potentially the aura of lethal hits that the Tech Marine can bring. That could help the Strength 10 missile launcher punch up if needed. Overall, I'd rate it as a solidly efficient gun turret. I've given it an 8 out of 10 here, might have been persuaded to give it a 9 if I was generous. Next up, we've got the Invictus Tactical Warsuit for 140 points as well. This guy is the Primaris piloted war mech with the scout keywords that can move up the board early, and has quite a lot of damage output that should destroy enemy infantry quite well, but won't really be all that much of a threat to tanks and vehicles. The autocannon is just fairly general purpose against most targets. The Incendium cannon goes through hordes quite well and could allow for some fairly big overwatch, and weirdly enough, compared with its counterparts, it gets strength 14 on its melee, maybe giving it an extra big tank shock if you wanted that. Compared with the other walkers though, I'd say for a pure damage and defense point of view it doesn't hold up quite as well. Only toughness 8 and a 3+ save is a fair bit below the Dreadnoughts, and its range damage at least is only kind of threatening against things that don't have high saves or vehicle armor. I feel like perhaps the scout move is the main draw for it, to be able to get some armor forward early, and it does have a return fire special rule if you happen to have a fair bit of Phobos around. Occasionally that could yield it an extra shooting phase, which could be kind of nice. Overall, I've chosen to rank it a 6 out of 10, perhaps just a little bit underpowered compared with some of the rest, and maybe a bit dependent on doing some sort of clever things with the scout move to actually make up the rest of the value versus the Dreadnoughts. Moving on to tanks and armor now, and first up we have the trusty Predator, 130 points for either the Annihilator or the Destructor, and I feel like they're at least fairly balanced between the two at that kind of points cost. The Predator Annihilator gives you some focused anti-tank with re-rolling damages of 1, and the Destructor gets extra AP against things that aren't monsters or vehicles, giving it some fairly savage heavy bolter and autocannon firepower, good for clearing things like Space Marines and Terminators. Again, it'll like Ironstorm for some big rerolls, the Annihilator in particular, though I feel like it's in fairly direct competition with a bunch of the other Space Marine things that shoot down armor, and in general its numbers just stack up as a bit worse overall compared with many of the rest, kind of similar to the Ballistas while not having the flexibility of missiles or the durability, and not quite as efficient against enemy armor compared with the Lancer or Repulsor Executioner. Overall, for those reasons, I've chosen to rank the Predator tanks a 6 out of 10. Generally not terrible though, as general purpose gun turrets with good range, but they feel like they're just a little bit behind the pack still. Maybe something like a 5-point decrease could make them significantly more tempting. Next up, we've got the Vindicator at 190 points. This guy with his Demolisher Siege Cannon spits out some massive anti-tank damage with the blast keywords to have a little bit more threat against infantry squads. Its durability, I'd say, is kind of mid in cover with Armor of Contempt. The 2+ save is nice and the good toughness is good, but it does cost a huge 190 points, and it has a handy special rule where even if it gets locked up, it can still fire to full effect against the thing it's in combat with or anything else at range. I'd say it's likely best in the Ironstorm Spearhead, both for that sustained/lethal hit stratagem, and quite liking the rerolls as well, and I feel like it is a lot stronger there compared with elsewhere. For the downsides, it is fairly costly, it is still fairly swingy with d6+3 shots and a big d6 damage, and compared with some of the other gun platforms out there, it's a little less flexible with no option to divide firepower amongst multiple targets. The slightly shorter range might not help either if you're firing against stuff that's longer away, or needing to make it get closer and expose itself a bit more than other tanks might need to. Overall though, it can definitely spit out some fairly scary raw numbers. I've chosen to rank it an 8 out of 10 overall. Next up for Space Marine artillery support we have the Whirlwind, 145 points for an indirect missile launcher with d6+3 shots at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2. One or more of these can just be pretty helpful to try and focus down enemy units taking objectives, or just very fragile damage dealers hiding from your wrath. Potentially can work quite well with Oath of Moment as well to get those hits in. Otherwise, as an indirect fire thing that doesn't have much particular threat direct, it doesn't need to expose itself, though I guess you could peep round the corner of a ruin to fire a hunter-killer missile if it made sense. It does really quite like some detachments, Ironstorm Spearhead for lethal hits, and can use the big sustained hit stratagem if you want yet more indirect fire, and it can be quite nice in the Anvil Siege Force as well to hit on a 3+ rather than a 4. Otherwise it triggers battle shock tests for enemy infantry, and can work quite well with a bunch of the other buff or debuff marine units, things like Encursors, Storm Speeders, or the Combi Weapon Lieutenants. For downsides, it won't be much of a threat to anything that's toughness 9 or more, and even with its advantages, it's kind of lowish damage anyway. It does pay an expected premium for Ignore's line of sight. The Your Turn Battle Shock rule maybe isn't the most useful either, given that it will have healed by the time that the enemy next scores objectives. Still though, really quite a popular artillery choice, and you can just hit one on a home field objective to contribute to the battle while keeping it safe. Overall, I've chosen to rank it a 9 out of 10. Next up, we've got the Gladiator Lancer, 160 points as a dedicated heavy destroyer. It fires off 2 shots at strength 14, AP 4 and damage d6+3 with a laser destroyer, with a reroll hit, wound and damage roll into the bargain. And compared with most of the other Space Marine units at longer range, it usually masks out to be the single best anti-tank unit. Otherwise, it does have a few incidental supporting fire weapons with Storm Bolters, Stubbers, and Icarus pods, and it might be handy enough to know that this one doesn't usually really need any help from Oath of Moment for reliability, so you can use that somewhere else. Otherwise, for downsides, it's a bit less tough for the cost compared with several of the competitors, from the Repulsor Executioner to the Ballistas and the Predator. It's not really very general purpose and basically just does destroying tanks. Only 2 shots means it won't have that much value against infantry units, and high invulnerable saves could be a bad news for it, as it's massively valuable for your opponent to command point reroll a failed one, so it might give them a good chance of stopping the damage. Overall though, still pretty excellent dedicated anti-tank. I've chosen to rank it a 9 out of 10. For the other Gladiator variants, we've got the Gladiator Reaper, anti-infantry dedicated this one, getting sustained hits 2 against infantry, and a nice twin-linked devastating wound turret. It should put out at least a few devastating wounds against most targets in the game, as well as infantry squads. It might particularly like the critical hits on a 5+ buff from the Ironstorm Spearhead if you just want to focus down a horde. Getting sustained hits too on all of that could be quite big. The Gladiators all get better in Black Templars as well, with the option to bolt on some really quite cheap multi-melters, which could make it a bit more of a general purpose threat. And overall I think it's kind of fine for what it does. Limited damage against heavies, but helps it have its niche against infantry. If your Space Marine force is a bit too low on things that could destroy horde units if you face them, then it's not a reasonable stopgap to put in. Overall I've chosen to rank it an 8 out of 10, definitely does see some competitive play, perhaps just feels a little bit less essential though, given that quite a lot of Space Marine units destroy enemy light infantry fairly well, just with incidental melee attacks or bolters or stoppers and things. Finally, for the Gladiators, we've got the Gladiator Valiant, 150 points for the Multi-Melter and Last Talon variant. This one puts out a whole bunch of Strength 9 and Strength 10 firepower, getting +1 to hit against the closest monster or vehicle unit with its Last Talon. Beyond that, it also gets some fun secondary weapons as well, gets better in Black Templars for yet another Multi-Melter to really dedicate it to its purpose, and might particularly like anything that helps get it in range like Gladius or Firestorm. Firestorm could be quite nice to get the melters to strength 10 if you can get it up and close as well. I think the main weakness of this thing is its short effective range. The Last Talon's okay, but you really need to get the multi-melters in range for it to actually get good, and ideally within 9 inches for the melter range, if you really want to actually be good at threatening monsters and vehicles compared with other things out there. Given that there's a lot of other good tank killer or infantry killer units out there, I feel like the range of this one is a bit of a downside. I've chosen to rank it a 6 out of 10 overall. Just doesn't really feel quite as easy to use or deliver the damage compared with some of the rest, and doesn't really have the durability to be right on the front line. It's probably going to get shot dead. Really big tanks next, and next up we have the Land Raider and the Land Raider Redeemer. I grouped them together as I'd consider basically them the better out of the ones versus the Land Raider Crusader right now. 240 points for the standard Land Raider and 260 for the Redeemer. They're basically great for delivering units into melee into combat with assault rams. Move them 10 inches up the board, disembark to 3 inches, and then an average 7-inch charge means that you should have a 20-inch charge threat range. They perhaps seem like they could be some of the best choices for aggressors, but could be fine with Blade Guard or chapter-specific units, maybe things like Black Templar Sword Brethren. That's really quite a big selling point, but just in general they're fairly efficient big tanky units. Lots of defense with 16 wounds with a 2+ save, and really quite good damage output with either quad las cannons for some focused anti-tank, or the Redeemer Flamestorm cannons with some really quite big marine cooking ability and some really nasty overwatch threats. Plenty of value for these in all sorts of different detachments. Gladius could be interesting to deliver aggressors, maybe with the Fire Discipline combo. Firestorm could be nice for torrent delivery and is just quite nice for transports in general. And Ironstorm could give you some big rerolls and other vehicle support things. Vulcan Hestan could work quite well buffing the Flamestorm cannons of the Redeemer too. For downsides, their big footprint means that hiding them could be very hard or impossible, particularly if you want to have them moving up the board, but at least they should be able to tow into behind ruins fairly easily, so should be getting a cover save. Their transport capacity can be a problem for some combos, say for example if you want 6 aggressors plus a character that'd be a Redeemer, you couldn't fit them in the standard Land Raider, and if you needed 2 characters attached to an aggressor squad that would be the Crusader. Overall, really efficient big tank units at the moment. I've chosen to rank them a 9 out of 10. Otherwise, I would say that the Crusader maybe isn't quite as standout as these. It is the cheapest at 230 points, but comes with quite a lot less threat. I feel like those Hurricane Bolters will absolutely shred hordes, but they're really just far less valuable to have compared with either Las Cannons or Flamestorms. As mentioned, the main reason that I'd want to take these would be if you actually need all the extra transport slots, like with aggressors with 2 characters. Or I guess if you're just so desperate for anti-infantry fire compared with other things, but even then I will be more tempted by the Redeemer. Overall I scored a 7 out of 10 though, still really quite strong and it could absolutely be the right choice for certain units, but if points and the detachment are allowing, I would probably go for one of the others. For the Primaris big effort transports, we've got the Repulsor, that's 190 points for this floating horror fortress. 16 wounds at toughness 12 with a 3+ save I think is fine durability for that, and while damage output might not be its main thing, it does have some fairly general purpose threat between las cannons, heavy onslaught Gatling cannon, and defensive array. It's got quite a big transport capacity that's nice for certain ranged damage dealers like Hellblasters, Eradicators, or maybe Aggressors or Infernus Marines with their Flamestorm things and Firestorm. And the Repulsor special rule is a good one for supporting ranged units. If they get charged, then you can re-embark back within the tank, potentially meaning that the opponent's got nothing to charge, or at the very least, even if they charge and destroy the Repulsor, the squad inside will get another turn to shoot. It's really quite a strong vehicle for Firestorm, given that it's both shooting focused and also has transport support rules for buffing shooting units. And again, it gets better in Black Templars, getting to bolt on and multi-melter onto the top. For downsides, its damage output is okay but not standout. It does have some competition with the Land Raiders as well for delivering anything melee, where Land Raiders will probably be the best choice there. Either way though, it's still a very strong tank. I've chosen to rank it an 8 out of 10, maybe could be a 9 in Firestorm. Next up, we've got the Repulsor Executioner, a little bit more expensive than the standard Repulsor at 220, and this one pays for another extra big gun on the top. My favourite will probably be the Heavy Laser Destroyer, though the big Macroplasma like the Redemptor is definitely quite nice for killing elite infantry. It backs that up with plenty of secondary shots, has a small transport capacity to put a small unit in. You could have some Eradicators hide within it, for example, and it feels like it could be quite nice in Ironstorm Spearhead with rerolls for the main big gun. Plus could be quite a nice focal target of things like that sustained hit stratagem, as it affects such a big and general purpose threatening unit. For downsides, it is kind of big investment and a good focus for enemy anti-tank firepower. I'd say at 220 points its durability is okay but not standout, and its special rule for destroying heavily injured things is kind of weak and rarely takes too much important effect. Overall, I've chosen to rank it an 8 out of 10. If anything, that might have been a little bit generous. I probably would have debated between 7 and 8 for it. They aren't quite as commonly used as other things like the Gladiator Lancer, though I do feel like the Repulsor Executioner is maybe a little bit underrated. Its raw numbers are genuinely quite good, and it's got a bit more flexibility and that transport capacity compared with other dedicated gun tanks. Moving over to Forge World for the really big grav tank, we've got the Astraeus. This one's the Primaris Super Heavy at 525 points and has fairly general purpose firepower between twin-linked 12-shot big guns with damage 3 and 2 sponsons where both the Las Rippers and the Plasma sponsons are pretty threatening. Far more so than any of the other units here, this is an enormous tank with a big profile and will get great value out of any boost that you can give it, whether it's stratagems or a Tech Marine to make it hit a bit better. For downsides though, it does have a ridiculously enormous physical profile that on certain tournament maps you just might not be able to actually even move through bits of terrain. Could really limit where exactly on the map it can actually get to. The strength 9 and AP -1 on the main gun does maybe limit a bit how scary it really is to hard targets, particularly things with high saves. And I feel like in general, realistically, Space Marine armies are probably going to get more value from a whole bunch of smaller tanks. You could say have a terrifying trio of Gladiator Lancers for less than the same cost of this. Still though, definitely not unusable, and I feel like it's far more so if you can actually guarantee that it has good movement lanes to go down. I've chosen to rank it a 5 out of 10 here. Next up, let's take a look at some speeders and flyers, and first up we've got the Storm Speeder Thunderstrike, a vehicle unit with fly at 160 points. This one's got some fairly threatening anti-tank shots with its Las Talon, plus some missile launchers, all hitting on a ballistic skill 2+, and it should be able to get lines of sight with really quite a fast 14-inch move. It also hands out a +1 to wound against an enemy monster or vehicle unit. Really quite nasty stuff for a focused Space Marine firepower force. It should be able to get you some better value from a lot of units against those kind of targets. For the downsides, for 160 points, it's really quite fragile for its defensive profile, not hard to kill for most enemy anti-tank guns at all. It's also quite a big vehicle and fairly points intensive, which maybe isn't the best for fast moving things, playing movement shenanigan sort of games. Losing it could be quite a big deal. I feel like it does have the disadvantage of being really quite matchup dependent as well. If you're playing a force without enemy monsters or tanks, then you're basically going to get really limited value out of this, and it'll look really disappointing compared with other options. Overall, I've chosen to rank it a 7 out of 10. Usable enough in a gunline focused Space Marine army, though I probably wouldn't take more than one. Otherwise, for the Storm Speeder variants, we've got the Hammer Strike at 150 points. This one has a bunch of Strength 9 and Strength 10 firepower. Its Melter Destroyer gun needing to get kind of close to be able to be used though, and its special rule is to strip the benefit of cover from one enemy unit that it's targeted. Only having its damage output at Strength 9 and 10 I think is a bit of a weakness, as is needing to get as close as it needs to compared with the Thunderstrike that doesn't. and for 150 points I don't really think that stripping cover is that spectacular. Certainly less impactful than the +1 to wound that the Thunderstrike has. I've chosen to rank it as a 6 out of 10 overall. Lastly, for the Storm Speeders, we've got the Hail Strike with the anti-infantry version. That one's cheaper at 130 points and does have good damage output against light infantry with a lot of spammed AP 0 shots with damage 1, but really is aggressively not general purpose and won't even really be particularly threatening to standard Space Marines, never mind anything heavier. Its debuff rule I think is a genuinely quite good one though. It gives you an AP boost for your entire army shooting the same unit as it, but that AP boost only affects things that aren't either monsters or vehicles. It could be really strong in certain games when you're fighting against enemy Terminators perhaps, but entirely useless in games where you're mainly wanting to deal with hard targets, which often tend to be the things that have high saves anyway. Overall, with the least threatening damage profile, I feel like it feels like the most niche of the Storm Speeders, even with the special rule being okay situationally. I've chosen to rank it a 5 out of 10. Maybe if you're expecting to play Terminators or high-value light infantry in just about every army you could go up against, it might be a bit more worth it. Next up, we've got the Space Marine Flyers, and first up there's the Storm Raven gunship, a 240-point aircraft transport vehicle. With slightly better durability than some flyers out there, it's got 14 wounds at toughness 10 with -1 damage. Still not what I'd call actually standout durable compared with other vehicles, but a lot better than most flyers. It gets a fair few heavy-hitting anti-tank style weapons with missiles, las cannons and multi-melters, and has a whole bunch of twin-link shots with its hurricane bolters. And it can fly 20 inches up the board, drop off a couple of units, and allow them to shoot as well. I think it's a bit better in the Firestorm detachment, given that that's a transport vehicle, and it could also help out its hurricane bolters with a +1 strength. And it does have the fun ability to transport a Dreadnought as well if needed, so it could deploy one of those into battle. For downsides, as mentioned, it's still not really all that tough. You definitely could be losing this turn 1 if the opponent's got long-ranged, high-power anti-tank and having the contents of it have to walk. If it is moving towards the front of the enemy army, it's likely to attract even more attention, and that is a lot of points gone when it goes. And in general, I think people prefer the Repulsors and Land Raiders to transport units in if you're going for a big investment one, having a bit more durability as well as their other advantages. Overall, I've chosen to rank this a 5 out of 10, though I'd rank it significantly higher in Firestorm, where it does get some big advantages. Next up, we've got the Stormhawk and Storm Talon, the smaller skirmishing Space Marine flyers, 155 points for the Stormhawk and 165 for the Talon. As flyers, they're really quite fast and easy to get lines of sight, and are a bit better in Ironstorm Spearhead for rerolls, plus maybe they could be interesting choices for that auto-explode stratagem, potentially a unit that could be getting towards the centre of the enemy army fairly early in the game if they really wanted to. For the downsides though, their durability is just really quite bad for both of them, very easy to kill compared with just about any other Space Marine vehicle, and I feel like their damage output is maybe a bit too mid for that. They certainly do get fast movement, but I feel like they're paying a bit too much of a tax for it. The Stormhawk also has the disadvantage of needing to start off the board as well, so that can only attack you turn 2. Not the end of the world, but you could choose to put really quite a lot of things in strategic reserve if you wanted to, for a similar sort of effect. Overall, I've chosen to rank them a 4 out of 10 overall. Even with their good movement, I feel like you're probably paying a bit too much of a premium for it, at least compared with other good Space Marine damage dealers. Next up, for the really big flyer, we've got the Thunderhawk gunship, which comes at the monumental cost of 840 points, and really quite a lot of real-world money from Forge World. As you'd expect, for that spectacular cost, it does have a dangerous main gun. It can carry a lot of Astartes into battle, and deep strike units can charge after disembarking, which could mean that you could have jump units charge out quite quick, and just having a whole load of wounds all stacked together in one big intimidating profile can cause problems. Some enemy armies won't be able to destroy this. For the downsides though, it's a ridiculous amount of points invested in one model. Some armies will have the anti-tank to be able to deal with it, and then that's almost half your army gone. And even with some scary stats on the main gun, realistically neither its damage nor defense is particularly good for this kind of cost, not compared with its weight in other units. Not being able to contest objectives doesn't help as well. Overall, I've chosen to rank it a 2 out of 10, a bit impractical and more of a big fun unit to use in really big games of 40k, rather than something that's particularly competitively optimal. Transport vehicles next, and first up we have the Rhino, 75 points for the Firstborn Battle Taxi. This does basically what it would do for other factions, tough for the cost, has some firing points on the top to fire heavy weapons out of, auto repairs some wounds if it gets damaged but it's not destroyed, and has quite a good transport capacity for the cost at 12 models. I'd argue it perhaps has a bit more use for certain divergent chapters with other interesting firstborn units, just as it's really got the option of Devastators or Tactical Marines right now, and both of those just don't really feel like a particularly good fit. The Tactical Marines are a bit overcosted and just not very good. The Devastators aren't enormously efficient and might likely either prefer to foot slog or use a Razorback. Maybe it could be interesting for something like some dirt cheap Blood Claws with Ulrich the Slayer with them, or I guess perhaps some Foot Death Company or Death Watch veterans as a push. Overall, I've chosen to rank it a 7 out of 10. I'd say it's not really a bad unit, but just doesn't really have the things that it needs to transport. It'd have a lot more use if it was able to transport Primaris units with things like Hellblasters or Blade Guard as options. Otherwise, for the Razorback, it's 95 points as another dedicated transport vehicle. I'd typically want to field it with a las cannon with a solid anti-tank shot with twin links. It gets a hunter-killer missile like the Rhino, and its big special rule is to allow reroll wound rolls for one disembarking unit if it shoots at the same thing. I feel like that could be perhaps be most interesting for delivering multi-melter devastators, perhaps in the Firestorm detachment. It could be one way of getting them within 9-inch range and potentially have strength 10, damage d6 plus 2 multi-melters on the go, re-rolling wound rolls to get some better damage against hard targets. Still though, that does feel like a really quite specific use. Again, being locked out of transporting Primaris is kind of big for this. It does have a much lower transport capacity, and is pricier and has no firing deck compared with the Rhino. Overall still a bit niche and definitely a very rare sight on any sort of competitive list, but I feel like it's something that you could use in Firestorm perhaps. I've chosen to rank it a 6 out of 10 between all that. Next up, we've got the Primaris transport in the Impulsor. 80 points for really quite an efficient vehicle all round, I think. It transports 6 units with a 12-inch move and gets a full firing deck, so everything embarked can fire out, which is quite nice for things like Hellblasters. I'd say its durability is good enough for 80 points, and you've got the option to tack on a missile launcher on top, or take a 5+ invulnerable save if that's better. Its special rule is advance and drop, which I guess could be okay in either Firestorm or Gladius, where you might be able to advance and shoot for a turn. And for contents to go inside it, you could have just some cheap objective controlling troops. Hellblasters could use it to fire their guns on overcharge without disembarking, though I feel like maybe one of the single best fits is Black Templar Sword Brethren with Hellbrex. Seems like some fairly maximal danger unit within a cheap transport there. It's extra good with Black Templars as well, as it can trade out that stubber for a multi-melter, just adding to the amount of danger in it. For weaknesses, it does maybe feel like a slightly diminishing returns luxury choice, as there's maybe only so much value in getting a unit or two to the midfield early. And it's kind of annoying that within core Codex Space Marines, perhaps one of the single best units it could transport in Blade Guard veterans don't really work with the transport slots, as he can't have a max unit plus a character, as that's 7 models. That one does feel kind of like an arbitrary oversight, and makes it far less good for them. Overall, I think it's solidly usable, but maybe just tends to get a bit overlooked as a way of doing things. I've chosen to rank it a 7 out of 10 overall, definitely good for the right units like Hellbrex Sword Brethren. Lastly, for the transport, we've got the Drop Pod at 70 points. This is the iconic Space Marine first turn delivery system, deep striking a unit turn 1 to shoot at the enemy, though it does pay a big 70-point price tag to do so. It can take Primaris Marines, including things like Infernus Marines and Hellblasters, or the Stern Guard, and then having a random drop pod on the board can be handy for scoring secondary objectives. It does have a little bit of objective control, and it's going to be a super low priority unit for your opponent to actually deal with. It's not actually a dedicated transport unit, so you could potentially drop one empty just to do secondaries or get in the opponent's way. Though I feel like maybe one of the most exciting uses for it might be to deliver Infernus Marines to be buffed by Vulcan Hestan, who's already on the board, maybe getting some big scary rerolls in Firestorm. For downsides, it does only have a 10 model capacity, which means that you won't be able to use characters with a maxed out unit. Either you'd have to drop a model in that 10-man squad, or forego either part of the unit or the character. It does feel like it's priced at a luxury again at 70 points, and you need to carry quite a lot of value inside it to really make it worth it at that cost, and it doesn't really do too much after that. And a mobile unit being forward deployed could be kind of unhelpful for causing issues with enemies hiding in combat with it as well. People could potentially nuisance charge it, and then you can't directly shoot them as they're in combat with the pod. Overall seems a little bit peripheral, could be okay for certain unit builds. I've chosen to rank it a 5 out of 10. Lastly, for vehicle keyworded units, we've got the Hammerfall Bunker, which is a fortification vehicle. 175 points buys you a big tough bunker. 14 wounds at toughness 12 with a 2+ stave is fairly sturdy, and it strikes with some super crack missile launchers and either heavy bolters or twin heavy flamers. though its damage output is kind of weedy, only hitting on a 4+. Its special rule is to deliver some overwatch in the enemy turn, but you will still be hitting on 6s, and you can't do it multiple times like you could in the past with this, and it just doesn't really feel like a particularly strong special rule anymore. Otherwise though, this thing just has a lot of downsides compared with mobile vehicle units. You can't move to get lines of sight, you can't claim objectives or move to do so. The damage output on a 4+ is really quite bad versus any enemy modifiers like stealth, and anything with good toughness of toughness 10 or more will generally be quite tough against it and won't usually have to worry too much. Overall, between all that, it really feels like it's going to be the right choice compared with vehicle units. I've chosen to rank it a 3 out of 10. Moving on to Space Marine characters now, and I thought we'd start with the generic characters and then go through all the special characters within Codex Space Marines after that. Starting out with the captains, I thought we could talk about a few general points and then go through the specific characters. In general, most of them have fairly good combat compared with most of the other characters, with quite a lot of higher AP, higher damage attacks that hit on a 2+. They get a 4+ invulnerable save to keep them a little bit safer than some of the other characters, and they all come with their own unique special rule. The main captain special rule is to get 1 free battle tactic stratagem per battle round, and that can have absolutely huge value depending on the right detachment. Could be quite nice for, say, some aggressors with the fire discipline combo in Gladius, or getting the Torrent Flamer stratagem to go off for free with the Firestorm detachment. It is a bit detachment dependent though, depending on how good the battle tactics are. As well as that, most of them don't really give you any sort of direct damage or defensive increase to their squad, and they're a bit pricier than a few of the other characters out there. I feel like it's maybe kind of hard to give the captains any sort of arbitrary points value, as it really just depends on what sort of detachment you're running and what sort of unit you're boosting, and depending on the combo of those, it could genuinely be the right choice. Running through them, I'd say the standard captain is perhaps particularly nice for Blade Guard. He has his special rule for getting a big burst of damage once per game, though a couple of the units like Blade Guard and Hellblasters need locked loadouts for his war gear, which gives him a little bit less flexibility. The Phobos captain's 80 points, and he's a bit different in that he doesn't really have as much combat threat in himself, getting a sort of sniper attack instead. But instead he gets really quite a big redeploy special rule where you could move Phobos units around or put them into strategic reserve, which could be quite a big deal on getting the first strike on the opponent properly. Probably good enough to think about if you're taking lots of Phobos units, but definitely not if not. The Gravis captain's 80 points, and he's really quite tanky with -1 damage, has a good choice of melee profiles, and aggressors feel like they're particularly good for the free stratagems, lots of the best detachment things revolving around them. Not really too many bad things to say about him. I guess he does make the squad a bit higher commitment, so if you start to lose aggressors, it's going to have even more impact, and he might not be your first choice compared with the Apothecary Biologist. You could take both, but I don't think people always want to. The Terminator captain's 95 points, and is a bit more expensive. He gets Deep Strike and free stratagems on really quite a big and threatening unit, so generally quite good there. Reroll charges could be quite a big deal with his Deep Strike as well, giving them a better chance of getting into combat without wasting a CP. He is the most expensive though. Finally, the Jump Captain is 85 points. He's fast and gives you +1 strength on the charge. In general though, I feel like the Jump Intercessors and Vanguard Veterans maybe don't generally get used as the most mainline damage dealers ever for the Space Marines. And if you're using them in smaller supporting roles, you probably just want to keep them cheap or take more units rather than a fancy character. Overall though, I basically would say that any of these are pretty usable. I've generally rated them around about 7 or 8. As mentioned though, just very dependent on the actual detachment being used. Next up, for the Space Marines second in command, we've got the Lieutenants. These guys all give lethal hits to the unit, which can be very nice in making squads of Space Marines with lower strength weapons punch up hard against tougher stuff. You can potentially use them for some combos like the Gladius Fire Discipline combo as well. Sustain lethal hits on a 5+, and you can do something similar in Anvil Siege Force. Lieutenants can be added to a unit at the same time as a captain or chapter master, which can be quite big for building some really big scary Space Marine units. And again, each flavour of Lieutenant gets a slightly different special rule. In general, I think they're pretty efficient, though besides the Storm Shield one, they don't get any sort of invulnerable save, maybe a little easier to kill than some as a result. For the specific Lieutenant, I think the standard one's really quite a good deal at 65 points. He can take a Power Fist or Storm Shield and Mastercrafted Power Weapon, and gives the squad 4 back and shoot, and can buff some useful things like Hellblasters and Blade Guard, and bear enhancements for both units. Seems really quite strong for 75 points overall, definitely makes their damage output scarier and more well-rounded on units that are already fairly threatening. Otherwise, the Phobos Lieutenant is 55 points. He gives you move, shoot, move, and potentially could be fun for setting up some close range Reaver charges. That could be kind of interesting for a unit coming in from deep strike and near guaranteeing a charge, even if they're not really all that threatening damage-wise. Both of the Phobos variants have some really quite low damage output though, and might be leading squads that you might just prefer to keep cheap as nuisance interference units. The actual Reaver Lieutenant though I think just competes very poorly. Basically does exactly what the Phobos Lieutenant does, but with less squad attachment and also a worse special rule. He doesn't get a grav shoot either, so can't join the squad when it deep strikes, meaning that he's just very specific and niche. I guess could be some use for Space Wolves Hounds of Morkai, though again you might take the Phobos one. Overall, I'd rate the standard lieutenant as perhaps particularly standout out of these. Several good damage combos and big investment units do seem to revolve around them depending on detachment. While we're on the subject of lieutenants, there's also the option of the one with the combi weapon who works very differently. 70 points for a Space Marine lone operative character. He barely does any damage whatsoever, but is kind of good at staying alive. A 5+ feel no pain, lone operative, stealth, and a reactive move, always quite a big combo. There's a good chance that if the opponent moves up to him, he could just move away to safety and still be there to threaten to do secondaries or just be annoying with enemy units nearby. On top of that, he also marks an objective for a reroll ones to wound. A fairly nice extra damage boost to have on an objective that your opponent is going to be putting lots of units on. And he can be kind of nice for screening areas given that he's so hard to take down, or could be used to trigger the lone operative style rules of Gilliman or the Lion, if you did want to tag team him with them. Otherwise, for weaknesses, he is much better in bigger games than smaller ones due to the special rule being more impactful, and he would be competing against other lone operatives like the assassins for the lone operative style role. The Calidus in particular is a popular choice for bouncing around the board doing secondary objectives, which is quite a big advantage over this guy, even if she costs a bit more. Overall though, does seem solid enough. Plenty of Space Marine armies choose to take one. I've chosen to rank him an 8 out of 10. Librarians next, and these sanctified Space Marine Psychers get a bunch of damage 2 attacks with their Smite at range, have rules that protect their lead unit against psychic attacks, contribute some melee with their force weapon, and also have one of their own buffing rules that varies quite greatly depending on the exact librarian. For downsides, their melee is not quite as strong as most captains or lieutenants. The psychic keyword can be a downside to a unit, as some weapons have anti-psyker, and you can't take a second character within the same unit like you can with lieutenants or captains. For the specific ones, I'd perhaps say that the standard Primaris Librarian is perhaps a little bit lackluster. For 65 points, he gives his squad a 4+ invulnerable save, which definitely is kind of handy for Space Marines being a bit more resilient against high AP things, but is perhaps a little bit matchup specific. I still feel like for most of the Tacticus armoured Space Marines, you're still really not getting them to a point where they're actually genuinely durable. He basically just feels like it adds a bit of defense and a bit of damage to the unit without really doing all that much unique, and I haven't seen many people using one. Otherwise, the Terminator Librarian is a bit tougher with the Terminator armor he has, and he gives these units sustained hits, and perhaps have a little bit more time for that, particularly as he's a fairly cheap support character at 75 points, basically gives you a more dangerous squad at range and in melee. And finally, the Phobos Librarian I think might be the most interesting of the bunch. He costs 70 points to buy in. He does add a bit of actually genuinely good threat to the unit that he's leading with his force weapon and smite, which does up the damage of the Phobos units that tend to be not really that threatening. But most importantly, he gives the lone operative style special rule to the unit, and he can't be shot at greater than 12 inches away. It could give you just a ridiculously safe home field objective with a unit of infiltrators, a unit that you can't shoot at long range, and you also can't deep strike near, so very hard to close the distance unless you can literally move there. Perhaps the downside for him might be that it adds expense to screening units that might ideally be kept kind of cheap. If the enemy does catch up with their squads, then they really don't have much durability for their cost. Overall, I'd probably rate the Phobos and Terminator Librarians over the standard one by a little bit, though both of those still feel like maybe units as opposed to auto-includes for the things that they lead. Next up, we've got the Chaplains. These sinister Skullmask Space Marines add a +1 to wound when you're in melee, so generally make Space Marines far better at handling hard targets and vehicles. He gets a personal Rosarius for 4+ invulnerable, gives his unit leadership 5+, and contributes a few damage to melee attacks with their Crozius Arcanum. For weaknesses, I'd say they're competing against the Lieutenants, who offer similar sort of boosts against tough targets, and they also affect range. And again, it means that you can just take the one character within the unit, as opposed to having the option to double up with certain captain or lieutenant options. For the specific chaplains, the standard chaplain is 60 points. He feels like he's probably best suited to Blade Guard over Assault Intercessors and has an option to cancel Battle Shock once per game. The Terminator chaplain is 75 points. He has better durability for the cost, and as well as the melee buff, he also comes with a 4+ protection against mortal wounds, which is genuinely quite good whenever the Terminators get targeted by them, though it's certainly got less important now devastating wounds aren't mortal wounds anymore. Though even with that, he does make a Terminator squad significantly punchier in melee. The Bite Chaplain, 75 points, and is a fast and fairly tanky unit. He gets a Twin Bolter included, and just generally makes the Outrider unit a bit more dangerous both at range and melee, devastating wound shooting and +1 to wound in combat, kind of handy for those Strength 4 AP1 attacks. To be honest, for his own stat line, I think he's actually kind of good, and his buffs are good. He's just really limited by how good Outriders are right now, which I'd say is not very, particularly if you're taking big mainline, big investment units with lots of models. Finally, the Jump Chaplain is 75 points. He moves fast and can get a Power Fist as well as his Crozius for a bit more combat. +1 to wound is quite nice for both the Assault Intercessors and the Vanguard veterans, and he also contributes just a little bit more with some more mortal wounds on the charge, giving you potentially some really quite fearsome mortal wound impact hits if you're leading Jump Intercessors into the fray. Again, though, I haven't really seen too many people using those as actual mainline damage dealers. Doesn't help that the boost is falling on a lot of Strength 4 AP1 weapons again. I suppose at least there's a Power Fist Sergeant in the same unit though. Overall, again, I would still say that they're all pretty usable for their own stats. Perhaps my favourite might be the Terminator Chaplain for the +1 to wound on really quite a big threatening unit. If you want more dangerous melee Terminators, that's definitely one way you could go. The standard one does feel kind of nice with Blade Guard, but also has lieutenants and other options that might take precedence. Otherwise, and also associated with the Reclusium, is the Judas here. 70 points as a character unit that grants fights first with his Temper Mortis. Pretty intimidating for Space Marine squads in the midfield, where the opponent might have to really think twice as to whether they charge them. His melee is fairly punchy as well, with that great big Executioner Great Blade, a bunch of Strength 7 damage 2 attacks with devastating wounds and precision. I feel like Blade Guard are the best option for him as well, actually having enough threats that the opponent might care about them fighting first, when the Assault Intercessors might bounce off certain targets. For weaknesses, it's just maybe weighing up whether that fights first is really worth it at 70 points. It is a good rule, but also quite a lot of expense, and you could be getting just flat more damage dealing onto your unit with a lieutenant, or big game-changing stratagems with a captain. His +1 attack special rule is a bit meaningless as well. I think he's rarely going to be killing characters and then going on to fight again. It might happen in some games, but not in most of them. Overall, I've chosen to rank him a 7 out of 10. Could be alright if you wanted to, but loads and loads of competition. Next up, we've got the Tech Marine for the really quite cheap cost of 55 points. This Mars-trained Space Marine gets a +1 to hit for a nominated vehicle and also repairs that same vehicle for D3 wounds. He can stand with them out in the open with Lone Operative if needed, and I'd argue that his damage output between the Bolter Grav Pistol and his 2 types of melee attack is genuinely quite impressive for 55 points for a cheap support character. I do quite like his fun special rule when a vehicle nearby dies and he just gets an extra 3 attacks and can go off to smash something. Kind of fun to have him transform into a enraged melee character. They're particularly relevant and pretty much auto-include in Ironstorm Spearhead, where they can bear a couple of really good enhancements. I guess for weaknesses, obviously it does require you to have the right list, to have vehicles that are worth buffing, and he might have more trouble in boosting things that are moving aggressively forward towards the enemy, things like Redemptor Dreadnoughts maybe, as opposed to more gunline things. Overall though, absolutely very strong indeed if you've got multiple gunline vehicles that can use both of his buffs well. I've chosen to rate him an 8 out of 10, in Ironstorm Spearhead it'd probably be the full 10 out of 10 and auto-include. For Space Marine Banner Bearers, there's 3 different flavours of Ancients, the Standard one, Blade Guard one, and Terminator Ancients. The main benefit for all of them is giving +1 objective control, which does mean that the unit that's buffed is resistant to battle shock. As it drops to 0, then he increases it back to 1, which definitely could trade for victory points occasionally, though I'd say not reliably. Otherwise, the Standard one gets a 4+ Feel No Pain on objectives or in the midboard. That's just for him personally though, which I think is less useful. The Terminator one gets a damage buff as the squad takes casualties, could be alright, maybe on a really big 10-man unit. And the Blade Guard one gets an actually fairly good +1 attack boost once per game for the unit, which I'd say is probably good enough to compensate him from not having a fun power weapon of his own. The Terminator one and the On Foot one at least get a power weapon that they can bear into battle. and they do have the advantage of being able to join the unit with another character attached, and bearing certain locked relics to them, such as the Dark Angel's Pennant of Remembrance, which could be quite nice for a Deathwing Terminator Ancient. For downsides, I would say that their objective control boost is fine but a bit situational. Occasionally it might make the difference of claiming an objective, but a lot of times there might just not be enemies contesting it, or you might have had it anyway. For the standard one, the Feel No Pain only comes up when the whole squad is dead normally, which isn't that great, and the damage boosts of both of the other ones do have their downsides. Overall, I'm not the most convinced that they're probably the best choice compared with other options out there for leading units. Perhaps the one that I've got the most time for might be the Deathwing Ancient with the Pennant of Remembrance. I feel like that's probably enough layered buffs to get him over the line and be a really credible option. I've chosen to rank them at 5 out of 10 for most normal purposes though. Next up, we've got the Apothecary at 50 points. He resurrects one model in the unit if you've got a squad that's injured but not destroyed, and gives you a 2+ chance to gain a command point if the rest of the model's squad is killed. For 50 points, I wouldn't say that's the most standout though. He doesn't really have much damage output of his own. The command point boost is reliant on his squad getting wiped out, which won't be a good thing. And if you've got other ways of farming command points in one way or another, it might be redundant anyway. And it's sort of reliant on your opponent in a bit to damage a squad but not destroy it and kindly let you to heal back up, and even then only by restoring one slain model. I feel like it might be a bit more interesting if you could join Blade Guard, where you're restoring a big tanky model to the unit, but otherwise for 2 wound Space Marines I'm not quite as convinced. Overall, I haven't really seen many of these see play. I've scored him a 5 out of 10 here. For his Battlefield Scientist counterpart in Gravis armor, we've got the Apothecary Biologist. He's 55 points and acts more like a lieutenant in Gravis armor compared with an actual battlefield medic. The lethal hits that he gets on his unit is kind of interesting for all the things that he can lead, but probably most so for the aggressors, as they often might be wounding on a 5+. And he's the guy who can make the aggressors into something super scary with the Fire Discipline combo for the Gladius Task Force. Beyond that, he doesn't do too much damage, just with his Reductor Pistol type thing. Gets a little bit of extra objective control with OC3 going to OC9 if the squad slays an enemy unit, which could be really quite robust objective defense there. And he can join the unit when a captain's still attached as well, if you wanted to make a really big and dangerous unit. I guess his downside's a little damage output, and it's maybe a bit stronger in certain detachments like Gladius or bearing the Infiltrate trait for the Vanguard Spearhead. But overall, he definitely sees lots of play in competitive lists. I've chosen to rank him a 9 out of 10 along with the aggressors. Finally, we get to the named special characters of the Space Marines, and we'll start off with the Ultramarines with Rabute Guilliman, the Primarch himself. Guilliman's 360 points and has stats that you'd expect of a Primarch: toughness 9 with 10 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save, enormous melee damage with the Emperor's Sword capable of handling most individual models, and then his famed command benefits with either the choice of double Oath of Moment on 2 different targets, or 3 battle tactic stratagems to units within 12 inches, once in your turn and once in the enemy turn, which could be really quite big in certain detachments like Ironstorm Spearhead. You could be getting double Armour of Contempt in the enemy turn, and double sustained hits in yours. He gets Lone Operative style protection if near infantry, which could be triggered by certain things like Tet Marines or the Combi Weapon Lieutenant as well, and he gets his big chance to stand back up on death on a 3+ with 6 wounds remaining. Kind of an interesting one, that one. On the other hand, it's very intimidating for your opponent and could cause massive problems, but on the other hand, it's not really quite reliable enough to be relied on. It's going to be pretty feels bad when he fails it. On the other hand though, Guilliman is an absolutely huge chunk of points invested. He's probably going to struggle to justify his cost based on his combat abilities alone, and compared with pre-Codex, neither the free stratagems nor the double Oath of Moment is as good as it used to be for different reasons. His durability for 360 points isn't actually that great if he can actually be directly targeted, though he does often wind up as the last model alive in an Ultramarines army, even if the game is lost. Having the monster keyword also isn't amazing for him as well, as it means he doesn't interact particularly well with terrain, having to go around. Overall, I've chosen to rank him a 7 out of 10. I feel like he's not unusable if you want to put the Primarch on the table, though he's far from the auto-include status that he has been at several points in the past for the Ultramarines. Next up, we've got Marneus Calgar at 185 points. The Chapter Master of the Ultramarines brings a whole ton of value to the table. He's really quite punchy in himself, with a bunch of Twin Links damage 3 attacks, and able to have a bit of flexibility with unit selection as well, going for things like aggressors or Blade Guard veterans. His 2 bodyguards that he gets add a lot of value to the unit, lots of durable wounds with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, and then they get to hit with a bunch of strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2 attacks, hitting on a 2+. He generates a command point each turn, which is going to add extra value as the game goes on, and allows his units to advance, shoot and charge, giving them a much bigger threat range than they would have otherwise, and that is very nice both for the aggressors and the blade guard. If you want to go for maximal Death Star style units, you can also pair him with a lieutenant or an apothecary depending on the unit, and they can give the entire thing lethal hits and also bear enhancements. It is quite popular to run him infiltrating in the Vanguard Spearhead. Enormous threat, potentially charging your opponent right from turn 1 could be terrifying, or at least taking up a very threatening position in the midfield. I guess perhaps for weaknesses, there is some conflict between him getting stuck in and farming CP. If he dies too early, it could be really bad news. 185 points is really quite a lot to lose if his unit gets wiped out, and I would say that between him and the unit that he's likely leading, while it might take a lot of resources to put down, it's not really going to be all that tough for the cost overall. Overall though, he absolutely is top tier competitive right now, and I've chosen to rank him a 9 out of 10. Next up, we've got Uriel Ventris, 75 points for the Ultramarines captain of the 4th company, I believe, resplendent in his green trim. His big special rule is granting deep strike to one unit, and it doesn't have to be the unit that he's leading, so you could put it on some Devastator Centurions or some Eradicators, maybe Hellblasters, and have them drop in somewhere completely unexpected, bringing lots of scary damage to the foe. Again, he does seem to be a popular one in Vanguard Spearhead these days, with loads of people running him that way, potentially allowing that deep striking unit to repeatedly redeploy with the Vanguard stratagem could be nice for bouncing Devastator Centurions around the board. Beyond that though, he doesn't really do too much. He's just a somewhat fighty captain profile without the free stratagems. He does let you double up on a stratagem for his unit if it's important, but you still have to spend the CP, which I think is maybe a little bit less overwhelming. He does seem to be quite a good fit for the company heroes, basically having a lot of his value in that deep strike rule. So beyond that, he can just be an annoying tanky and somewhat threatening unit in melee. Overall, definitely could do with the right units to pair with, but he is running a lot of competitive lists at the moment. I'd probably rank him an 8 or 9 out of 10 just in himself, maybe more like a 9 or 10 in Vanguard. Next for the Ultramarines, we've got Chief Librarian Tigurius, 75 points, and I feel like he brings just an enormous amount to the table for that kind of points cost. A genuinely strong psychic damage attack with the Storm of the Emperor's Wrath, a little bit of quality melee with the Rod of Tigurius. He himself gets a 4+ invulnerable save, which most librarians don't. He gives the unit a 4+ feel no pain against psychic and mortal wounds, both of which are nice. -1 to hit for his unit against all things, so that helps out their defense. And then once per battle round you get a 0 CP stratagem, which includes a few reactive ones including Overwatch. Between all that, he feels just like a fairly standout good character for the cost. Perhaps to the extent though where you're more taking the squad to be a bodyguard for him rather than the other way around, which does feel a bit weird. I feel like he'd do particularly well with Hellblasters if he could join them, but unfortunately he can't. Maybe things like Standard Intercessors or Stern Guard could be interesting enough. I feel like he's alright with Blade Guard as well, but has far more competitors with other character choices for them. Not being able to pair with another character like a Lieutenant or an Apothecary or something is kind of annoying for not getting further buffs or damage combos and enhancements and things into the unit as well. Still though, for his personal value for 75 points, I think he is looking rather good. I'd rate him an 8 out of 10 overall. Perhaps one of his main issues is competing with the other very good Ultramarines characters like Calgar and Ventress. Finally for the Ultramarines, we have Cato Sicarius at 85 points. He has a captain style profile with a bunch of strength 6 damage 2 melee attacks. He gets lethal hits on his, and then gets a trio of special rules for his squad, scouts for the unit, assault weapons on their guns, and a once per game reactive move where if the enemy moves too close he gets to backpedal away from them. None of those rules are particularly bad, but they maybe just don't really feel particularly focused and might struggle to compete with just extra damage output or free stratagems, and he is kind of pricey at 85 points compared with some. Again, I feel like he's probably last choice out of the Ultramarines characters compared with any of the rest. Maybe not that great when they've got 4 other fairly credible options. Next up for the White Scars we have Corsaro Khan, 70 points for a fairly fearsome melee combatant, devastating wounds melee with precision for his personal attacks, and his lead unit gets assault weapons and lance melee. He also generates 1 command point situationally if he can slay a character model with that precision, and he could be a fairly cheap unit to throw into a Blade Guard unit to make them a bit more dangerous. I feel like he does perhaps fall into the sort of units that are just kind of fine for Blade Guard, things like chaplains, lieutenants, judiciaries, and standard Space Marine captains, though I think he's perfectly viable against those if you're playing White Scars. He is one of the many other characters as well that if you take him you can't take any other chapter specific stuff in the game, which is generally a bit of a disadvantage. Say compared with playing some of the Divergent chapters, where you might get an entire extra list of units rather than just one optional captain. Ironfather Phyros is 95 points for a boosted Tech Marine sort of profile. He comes in Gravis armor and can potentially join Heavy Intercessors or the other Gravis Marines, and his damage I think is fairly threatening between the Forge Bolter and his Harrow Hand plus Servo arm attacks, at least for what you might expect for a Servant of the Omnissiah. He's fairly tough with toughness 6 and a 2+ save. He grants a 5+ feel no pain to his lead unit, which I think is kind of stand out for things like Heavy Intercessors. That takes them from good durability to great, and ideally he wants to be paired with a nearby vehicle like the Tech Marines, giving them a +1 to hit and also repairing 3 wounds per turn. For downsides, I guess he's competing against the standard Tech Marines, which do the majority of what he does for vehicles, but just for 55 points. So really you need to get both value out of his 5+ feel no pain, his combat, and his vehicle buffing rules, which might be kind of hard to do all at the same time. He also can't take the Ironstorm Spearhead enhancements if you play in that formation, and that is another downside versus the standard Tech Marine datasheet. Overall, I've scored him a 7 out of 10 here. I think he does genuinely have interesting value on multiple different fronts, but between Tech Marines already being kind of fine for the role and him looking at other chapters' choices, I haven't seen him played in competitive very much. Next up, we've got Kayvan Shrike, and an 100-point jump pack character with twin-linked lightning claws. He can join the Assault Intercessors with jump packs or the Vanguard Veterans. For either of those units, he does add a fair bit of threat with the twin-linked AP2 and damage 2, helping them threaten some slightly harder targets, and he gives his squad the rule of not being able to be shot outside of 12 inches, so kind of lone operative protection. He also has the ability to have his squad jump off the table and return to reserves, though I'm a bit unsure as to whether that would usually be the best idea for his squad, as it does mean that he could be coming back with a slightly riskier charge move. For weaknesses, as with the other jump characters, neither jump intercessors nor Vanguard veterans seem to be really general purpose damage dealers that can take down enemy heavies reliably these days. And again, like the rest, if you're taking him, then you're looking at other character choices, as he's the only Raven Guard character. Still though, just for strength of the datasheet and lone operative style protection on a really quite big and threatening unit, I've chosen to score him a 9 out of 10. I think his special rules really are quite powerful. For the Imperial Fist, we've got Tor Garadon next at 90 points. He's a big Gravis armoured captain that gets strength 12, AP 4 and damage 4 melee against monsters and vehicles, though it goes down to damage 2 and AP 2 against other things. Besides that, he has a grav gun and the ability for his unit to ignore cover. Maybe could be alright on aggressors, I suppose, though he was drastically toned down from when he gave his unit lethal hits as well. Overall, he just doesn't really add all that much besides big damage if he does manage to fight his preferred targets in close combat, which it might be kind of hard to do given that Gravis is kind of slow. I guess he could be delivered out of a Land Raider. I feel like several detachments with the right stratagems might prefer a standard Gravis captain. And if you're going for the Boltstorm variant, I feel like an Apothecary Biologist might be the first pick before either of those as well. At the moment I've chosen to rank him a 6 out of 10, not really particularly standout. Next up, there's Datasheet Lysander for 100 points. The Hammer of the First Company of the Imperial Fist gives his Terminators a -1 to wound if the strength is greater than their toughness, and the majority of weapons that really threaten Terminators tend to be that. Beyond that, he just hits things really hard with strength 10, AP 3 and damage 3 melee with devastating wounds, and has a once per game ability to give his shield a 2+ invulnerable save. Could mean that he's just spectacularly hard to kill for one phase if his squad does get shot away. For him, I'd weigh him up against the free stratagems and damage buffs for the squad that the other Terminator characters can bring, and I feel like he might often not be the first choice due to not being able to take enhancements, which can be really big on Terminator units. He is also a bit pricier than those Terminator characters as well, which isn't an advantage, even if he does have some very hard-hitting close combat. Overall, I've chosen to rank him a 7 out of 10, perfectly playable, though maybe not enormously stand out from the rest. For their successors, the Crimson Fist, we have Pedro Cantor, 90 points for the Defiant Chapter Master of Rindsworld. For that, you get a fair amount of melee damage, with a bunch of Strength 8 and Damage 3 attacks in close combat with his Relic Power Fist, and Dawn's Arrow does put in a fair bit of range damage as well for a character. He's fairly durable with a 2+ save and a 6+ feel no pain above normal captains, and his special rules are 2 damage dealing ones. You get a damage boost as his squad takes casualties, provided it's not destroyed. and once per game you can trigger a +1 attack both for ranged and melee weapons in one turn, which could be kind of interesting with things like 4-shot Stern Guard or getting excess attacks with Blade Guard in combat. Overall, I think his raw numbers and boosts really are quite good. I think he's usable if you want to run Crimson Fists. He maybe does feel like a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none though. He could have been pretty standout if they'd let him lead something like Hellblasters with those extra shots maybe, though I feel like that's probably the reason that they didn't. Overall, I've chosen to rank him a 7 out of 10, a solid enough support character that does have his downsides with locking out other special characters out there, or trading him out for a character that could have taken enhancements perhaps. Finally, we've got the Salamanders, and first up there's Vulcan Hestan. He's 100 points for the Lord of Flamers and Melters. You get to nominate one target, and then all Torrent or Melter weapons in the army get to reroll wound rolls against that one that you've selected. It's pretty huge in Firestorm with the devastating wound stratagem to amp up Torrent weapons, and can be quite nice for the Land Raider Redeemer as well. Otherwise, he's fairly threatening in his own right, with a much boosted Heavy Flamer and Captain style close combat with that spear. He gets a 2+ save and a 6+ feel no pain as well, and he gets extra muscle on one nominated objective. If he sits on the point that you've picked, he gets objective control 10 and a 4+ feel no pain. Really quite nice if you could slog up there alongside some company heroes perhaps, to be a tanky annoying unit on that point that's almost certainly going to claim the point unless the enemy can actually kill them. For weaknesses, he's pricier than most, and he definitely needs some building around with certain useful units, or maybe the Firestorm detachment. Perhaps one of his biggest weaknesses is that some of the best Melter and Torrent units already get 4 rerolls to wound, things like Eradicators or Aggressors, which makes him redundant for some of the best versions. Still though, definitely usable, and I'd rate him an 8 out of 10 overall. Finally, last but not least, we have Adrax Agatone, 85 points worth of Salamander Might. He's all about delivering a beatdown at close quarters, lightly with some Blade Guard, given a Strength 10, AP 2 and Damage 3 hammer plus his AP 1 Torrent pistol, and his core special rule is reroll wound rolls in melee for him and his unit, which is excellent for the Strength 5 of the Blade Guard. If he gets locked down in a protracted combat, he also halves objective control for enemies in melee with him as well. Kind of situational, but if that ever sways an objective it will be big, and you could have him join with a lieutenant as well if you really wanted to make a very scary close combat unit. Overall I think he's pretty fine for his purpose. Blade Guard and him needs delivery to get to melee. I feel like he is probably good enough to be fairly standout versus the other things that could lead the unit, both having a great buffing rule and such dangerous melee in himself. Overall I've chosen to rank him an 8 out of 10, a genuinely very efficient Salamander's captain here. So anyway, there we have it, one brief look at every single unit in Codex Space Marines, with a few strengths and weaknesses, and a rough power sort of rating for each. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, particularly if there's any other important things that you think I've missed about the units. There was definitely a lot to cover here with all sorts of interactions and plenty of detachment choice, so look forward to hearing any other thoughts or insights. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos and you'd like to help keep big ones like this coming, I would also like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page too, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and be part of the people allowing me to make more of these. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.